Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope this video finds you well. And I really mean that. I hope this video really finds you well, or as well as can be expected wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would like to continue with my discussion of the works of the great John Carpenter. Today, I'd like to focus my attention, if you don't mind, on the film that he directed from 1996. This film is Escape from L.A. This is Escape from L.A. Snake is back. Snake Plissken is back in the world of John Carpenter, as personified by the one, the only, the legend that is Kurt Russell, who is also back in the world of John Carpenter films. We also have the very important Deborah Hill. She's back in the world of John Carpenter films. And when you see their names flash up on the screen with that iconic font for the opening titles that we know so well, that we love so dearly, that we know from the films of John Carpenter from the 80s, we have a feeling that, yes, indeed, we are back in John Carpenter world, and indeed we return to this world and leading the way on our journey is the one and the only iconic Snake Plissken in this quite surreal, over-the-top, zany, quirky, weird, very thrilling in places, almost like a thriller, like a spy thriller in other places, like an action-adventure comedy in others. It's a farce, it's a social commentary, and it is also very quintessential John Carpenter. It's a film that I think has received a lot of maybe negative critical appraisal, perhaps compared with other John Carpenter works, and I'll try to explain a little bit of my own evolution, if you will, with respect to this film. It is also, I think, a film that is inviting a lot of comparison, of course, with John Carpenter's early works from, let's say, the late 1970s to the early 1980s. And of course, the parallels and comparisons are drawn almost immediately, almost instinctively, by everyone who views this film to the earlier work that is Escape from New York. So those are fair comparisons, and perhaps with those comparisons being made, having to be made, and needing to be made perhaps as a result of those comparisons, the film Escape from L.A. might, to some people, come up a little bit short in the long run. But I think ultimately this film is still giving us an interesting voice, an interesting edge, and it's still being consistent with the world of Carpenter, while at the same time, I think, giving us something that I could arguably say is, on the one hand, similar to Escape from New York, but also on the other hand, quite strikingly different. And we are left with a very interesting puzzle of a film that I think is still one that maybe is still due for a grand critical reassessment and reappraisal by many people across the critical film critics board, if you will. But wherever you fall on the spectrum, my friends, I think there is no doubt that this film Escape from L.A. is a film that fits in very well in the world of John Carpenter. and there are many themes and concerns of the film that I think are consistent with John Carpenter's work up to now. And that alone, I think, makes for really important conversation when talking about this film, again, in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. But I would like to suggest that there is much more here, and I'll try to explain in the context of my own evolution on this film, having seen this when it was originally released in the late 90s, and then coming back to it over time until I find myself today watching this film again and again, and now sitting here talking with you about how I feel about this film. So before I get anywhere with the specifics of this film, let me say that this particular Blu-ray is sort of a standard Blu-ray that you can basically get now, Paramount release. And so there's nothing here except the trailer and the film. And so there are no special features as far as this particular release goes. Please note that right now it's the middle of April 2020. The new Blu-ray release of this film by Shout Factory, Scream Factory is scheduled to be released later this year. By my count, about a few months from now. And so I thought about, oh, should I wait until the Shout Factory, Scream Factory Blu-ray is going to be released, and then I can talk about this film. Maybe I should wait until then and explore the special features and all that stuff. Because Shout Factory, Scream Factory, as you know, they do really great work when it comes to releasing John Carpenter's films, and really give us a lot of things to think about and to absorb and to learn more about through the special features, etc., as well as giving loving attention to the presentation and also the artwork, etc. So I was seriously considering waiting for the Shout Factory, Scream Factory Blu-ray release, again scheduled for later this year. However, again, it's, I think, a good time to talk about this film, Escape from LA. And also, I must admit, living in Tokyo, I'm not sure exactly when I'll be able to receive that particular Blu-ray. I did pre-order it a long time ago, but given certain current world crisis events, international mail shipping has come to a halt or is otherwise significantly delayed, and so that might cause me to receive items well behind their release date in North America or something like that. And so rather than wait for any kind of release, which, as I say, might not necessarily get here in Tokyo until months and months after the fact, I thought, let us talk about this film now, based on this particular Blu-ray that I have now. Again, it's a kind of bare-bones Blu-ray, but it's better than not having the film at all, at least as far as this point in time is concerned anyway. And then sometime later, hopefully later this year, when the Blu-ray indeed arrives, fingers crossed, and I'm able to explore a little bit of the Shout Factory, Scream Factory Blu-ray release, then maybe, if you don't mind, I can talk about that particular release in a separate video sometime in the future. So if that's okay with you, then I'd like to, for now anyway, talk to you about this particular film, with the understanding again that when the Scream Factory, Shout Factory release of the Blu-ray does indeed arrive, that might give me an opportunity to make another video talking about that particular release, and maybe adding some more thoughts that I have with respect to this film, Escape from LA. But for now, my friends, let us focus on the film. And with that in mind, if you have not seen the film Escape from LA, please turn off this video now, and you can watch the film, and then you can come back at any time. This video will still be here. You can come back at any time, at which point I would very much love to hear your thoughts, your views, your reactions with respect to this very interesting work from John Carpenter. This is the film Escape from LA. Okay, my friends, so you're back, which means you have seen this film Escape from LA. So I think I should begin with a little bit of a personal journey that I've had with this film ever since the late 90s when it came out. and when I first saw the film, and then as I continued to try to revisit the film over the years until now, where I find myself, which is, as I say, April 2020, which is the time of this video. Usually with John Carpenter films, or not usually, for most of John Carpenter's works, actually for all of John Carpenter's works except for one, whenever I saw the films for the first time, I usually fell in love with them. I liked them, and maybe for some I really, really liked them. In other words, for all of the John Carpenter films except for one, the memories that I have of seeing them for the first time were ones where I usually liked them or really liked them or fell in love with them immediately. There are other John Carpenter films early in my life that I don't necessarily have memories of seeing for the first time because, as I've indicated in past videos, they might be films that I always remember knowing. I saw them since I was a little kid, and so I feel like I've always known them. There weren't times in my life where I didn't know certain John Carpenter films. So for those films, I've always felt like I've loved them. And then for those films that came in later and I saw for the first time, there are some films that I liked, some films that I really, really liked, and some films that I absolutely loved. And for all of John Carpenter films, except for one, there wasn't an instance where I saw the film for the first time and I didn't like it. As I say, there was one exception to that, and that exception was the film Escape from L.A. When I saw this film for the first time in the late 1990s, so I was in high school, college, that sort of time, and so I was in my late teens, and at the time, I was still grasping at the concept of cinema, what cinema was. I still am grasping at this concept, not knowing what it is now, and I'm working as hard as I can in order to try to get a better understanding of what cinema is and what John Carpenter cinema is right now. But back then, when I was in my late teens, I'd seen a lot of films, I thought, but not as many as I've seen now, but I did see as many John Carpenter films as I could, and I loved them even then. And then when I came to Escape from L.A., and after I finished watching it, I do remember feeling a sense of being let down, of feeling disappointed. And I think there were a couple of reasons. There were two main reasons that I think, thinking back on my initial reaction to this film way back in the late 90s, I can understand why I was disappointed for two reasons. First, as I alluded to earlier, this felt to me at the time to be a film that was too close to the plot beats and the character beats that we saw in the earlier work by John Carpenter called Escape from New York. I felt like they were so close to be almost like this film, Escape from LA, was almost like a remake of Escape from New York. And this was my feeling back in the late 90s. And therefore I thought it wasn't necessarily giving me something new. I really liked Escape from New York. And so if I'm watching this, I am reminded about how much I liked Escape of New York. And if it's doing that, if this film is doing that, then it's not necessarily giving me stuff to think about with respect to this film itself, if you know what I mean. So that was one thing that I felt when I was in my late teens. And then another thing that I felt was that I thought that this film, in terms of the special effects and some of the special effects that it was having on display, and in particular some of the CGI effects that were used, for instance, the submarine vessel sequence that is shown to show us how Snake Plissken gets to Los Angeles at the beginning, or some of the shots involving the surfing with Peter Fonda, and then we have Steve Buscemi's character driving along the side there. in his car, a very cool car, by the way. And so there's that special effects shot. There were some other special effects shot early on with respect to the earthquake that hit Los Angeles area. That really starts the whole ball rolling in terms of inaugurating in not only the president but also the president for life after the according to the film, after the Constitution has been amended. And but those special effects to show us the falling building debris and all this stuff felt like very obvious CGI effects. And when I was young, in my late teens, watching this film in the late 90s, after, again, during this period where you had a lot of CGI-based photorealistic effects coming to the fore in very blockbuster mainstream films at the time, to see film like this in that context, when I was young in my late teens, to be frank, I was at the time somewhat let down. I felt let down by the film because I thought this wasn't necessarily giving me what I was looking for, which is a kind of photorealistic special effects bonanza that had a story that was different enough from Escape from New York to stand on its own 2 feet. So those are the two reasons that at the time I felt a little bit disappointed by this film. And then over the years, I still visited the works of John Carpenter many, many times, and I always felt deep down in my heart, I always felt that maybe I did not give this film the chance that it deserved when I was watching it for the first time. And so I would periodically watch it again whenever I could. And so I tried to watch it again, and along the way, the film started to pick up steam for me. In other words, it did begin to grow on me, and slowly but surely, I began to find it charming, and I began to appreciate it more for what I think it was trying to do. This might also have been due to the fact that I was getting a little bit older. As I've mentioned many times on this channel, I was not perhaps the most open-minded in terms of being a film watcher, especially when I was in my late teens. I think I had a very close-minded approach. That's my own viewpoint with respect to watching certain films. I tried to be as open as possible, just given my own circumstances at the time. But I think I had a lot of growing up to do in terms of world experience, life experience, and things of that nature. Even now, when I watch a film, any film, I always feel like I have a sense of limitation to my own experience and also to my own sense of open-mindedness. I always feel like I should be much more open-minded than I actually am, and I always I'm always disappointed in myself for not being more open-minded. But I always try, and even when I fail, I will still try. And so, with that sort of viewpoint in my own self analysis, as it were, I come to this film again. And now that I watch this film, I've seen this film a number of times now over the course of many, many years since it was initially released back in the late 90s. And now that I am a little bit older, a lot older perhaps, than I was when I was in my late teens, now that I come back to this film, I feel like it's a film that fits so well. It fits so well. It's like a snugly fit glove. And it's a film that gives me a lot of joy, a lot of happiness when I see it. There are moments when I still laugh at the comic beats. I love the depiction of Kurt Russell as Snake Plissken, and I love the little details that emerge with respect to the narrative. I love how this film does hit on certain character beats and narrative beats that, yes, remind us quite vividly of moments that we saw in Escape from New York. But with that in mind, I do feel that now, I feel that this film is setting itself apart from Escape from New York. That's not to say that I dislike Escape from New York. I adore that film. I absolutely adore that film, Escape from New York. But I can still say that this film, Escape from LA, is doing stuff that is a little bit different than what I think Escape from New York is doing. And so I think that both films can exist. They can exist at the same time in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. In other words, there's nothing that says that you have to like either this film or that film. I think both approaches to the films are equally valid, and they speak to slightly different things. And I didn't recognize that at the time that I initially watched the film. But now that I've watched the film a number of times, I think I recognize some of the differences that I think this film is trying to say, as opposed to what Escape from New York was trying to do. So let me just address that point right now and say that I think that this, again, Escape from New York is brilliant. I have nothing against Escape from New York. And even the comments that I say now, please don't think that I am saying these in any way to try to negatively cast light on Escape from New York. I love that film, and I still do, and I think I always will. But once again, this film, for better or for worse, it calls attention to the fact that it is a sequel to Escape from New York, and it does have similarities. There are characters that fall into, in this film, that fall into the same feeling of character beats that we saw in the earlier work. The Cuervo Jones character, for instance, maybe brings to mind the Duke character, or maybe the Maptis Sarzetti character maybe reminds us of Ernest Borgnine character back in the earlier film, or maybe Taslima, the Valeria Golino character, maybe reminds us of the Faith Hubley character, the Chock full of Nuts girl in the earlier film. And there are certain other beats like this, the way that the gangs are assembled in terms of certain traits or characteristics, quite, I think, vividly and almost surreally expressed in this particular film with the plastic surgery people, and with Bruce Campbell at the head of that particular group there, the Surgeon General of Beverly Hills. But we saw these sort of communities that grew out of this society. We already saw this kind of community coagulation, if you will, assemble in the context of the world painted by Escape from New York. We see that here in Escape from LA. So there are certain beats that are repeated, and also the urgency given. The president in both films is involved. Granted, it's slightly different in terms of that film versus this film, but yes, the president is involved. There's a certain threat to national security at play. Here we have an impending invasion of the United States by the United Front of Third World nations that is planning to invade the borders of Florida at the time of this film. And at the center of this is some kind of MacGuffin or some kind of government secret or weapon or something of that nature. And here it's the sword of Damocles, this weapon that can essentially wipe out all power sources wherever it is aimed, which is quite a frightening idea the more one thinks about it. There are other character beats as well. The Pam Grier character, the Hershey character, maybe reminds us a little bit of the Harry Dean Stanton character back in the earlier work, and so on and so forth. And of course we have Snake Plissken with a timer, with certain challenges that he has to face along the way in this film. He has a certain life-threatening situation that compels him to fulfill and carry out the mission in both films. Those circumstances, of course, are played out a little bit differently. And here it's the idea of the Plutoxin 7 virus that is scratched onto his hand at the early part of the film. But we realize that it is not what is originally told to him. And so by Malloy and the president and others. And so, but the point is that there is a threat that he understands is a threat to his very life, and he has a limited amount of time to fulfill the mission. That was true in the other film, and it's true in this film. So yes, there are, of course, parallels and mirror scenes and mirror characters from that film to this film. No question, absolutely no question. But I do think that there is room for a little bit of divergence. And this film is going in a slightly different direction than the earlier works, Escape from New York, in a couple of quite key respects, I think. Okay, on the surface level, of course, there are those differences in terms of the plot. Of course, it's not exactly a scene-for-scene remake of Escape from New York, so there are different ways in which the characters resolve certain problems that confront them in the film. And granted, too, the characterizations of certain people don't necessarily play out in the same way that they did in the earlier films. So for instance, if we think that there's a parallel between the Ernest Borgnine character and the Steve Buscemi character in both films, I think you can realize that the parallels end when we realize what those two characters end up doing in the respective films. And we see, for instance, let's focus on Map to Stars Eddie, and we see that he is a man who is a very chameleon-like character. He very easily switches allegiances between the sides. He in a very interesting way almost reminds me of the way in which the Toshiro Mifune character in the Kurosawa films, Yojimbo and Sanjuro, seems to be able to maneuver his way between the sides. That the Steve Buscemi character in this film reminds me, at least in terms of how he survives, by basically breaking his allegiances here and then going assigning his allegiances elsewhere there. And so I love his almost lovable two-faced quality. And he has a way about him that I think is very different than Ernest Borgnine in Escape from New York. But that's a kind of an example of how there are minute story beats or character beats that do diverge in slightly different yet still quite engaging and subtle yet very potentially complex ways. But there are also sort of deeper beats that I think make this film it makes this film, or how should I put it, it allows one to look at this film and regard this film as being quite proudly set off from the earlier film Escape from New York. And one key example is the way in which the authority is portrayed, and in particular the way in which government is portrayed, the concept of government. And in the context of this film, the concept of government in this almost dystopian version of this country that is the United States in this year 2013 in the film, that it is a very dystopian setting in the sense that we do have a president that has been installed for life. There seems to be this way in which now these immoral crimes are being imposed, and people are being convicted of these sorts of immoral crimes and then thrown into sort of incarcerated, sanctioned cities like the Los Angeles of the title. And we realize also that the nature of their crimes is to do not necessarily all the time with the kind of crimes that we might understand are in the books in democratic societies that are prevalent in today's world, 2020. But I mean, I say that in the sense that maybe there is a fine line between truth and fiction, but perhaps the more I think about it, the more I realize that perhaps that line is not so pronounced, and maybe the fine line that I'm talking about is actually more faded than one might hope. But in any event, in the film, there is the sense of the immoral crimes, such as practicing one's religion in a state in the United States that would cause one to be thrown into Los Angeles, and that's the Taslima character, for example. There's also the idea of the inside of the Los Angeles perimeter, if you will, being the total opposite of the dystopian United States that is represented by the very characterization of Cliff Robertson's president. There is almost a horror in terms of the authoritarianism that he seems to be expressing in his performance, and the fact that his character is linking his almost authoritarian rule with that of a very almost kind of zealotry that is relying on his outward sense, as he expresses it, of his religious views. And so that pours into this depiction of a dystopian world, and the dystopian world is not necessarily the world of Los Angeles, surprisingly enough, but it's the world that is not Los Angeles, that is in fact the other side, as some of the characters put it. Again, Taslima comes to mind almost immediately when she is talking with Snake just before her sudden demise, which is quite shocking actually, but just before that really sad moment, she's talking with Snake about how it's better on the inside than it is on the outside. It's better here because this is freedom. That's how she expresses it. This is a state of freedom. Outside, out there, you don't have freedom. Inside here, you have freedom. And it's a freedom that is so extreme, perhaps relatively speaking, that it comes at the cost of her life. And we realize that just a moment after she expresses those words, quite suddenly, quite tragically, quite sadly. But I think that is a wonderful encapsulation of how I think that this film can be seen to be a little bit different than Escape from New York. Granted, in Escape from New York, there were themes about this kind of authoritarianism, in the sense of a militarism that was being expressed in terms of this idea of almost a police state imposed New York prison, if you will, expressed by the island itself. But here, in Escape from LA, I think this film is going in a different direction, in the sense that it is now focusing its attention on the fact that it's the state itself, according to the filmmakers here, it's the state itself that is the prison, or that is the dystopia. And it's the LA prison itself that is the freedom, that is the place where one can be free, almost too free, in fact. And I think that kind of delineation is really hammered home quite clearly and quite nicely. Again, granted, I think that kind of treatment is still existent in Escape from New York, but somehow, and especially how the film ends, this film seems to take that and ride with it to a kind of narratively logical conclusion as the film ends, and Snake Plissken, of course, makes his decision to implement the sort of Damocles weapon by inserting the world code, not the code for the United States and not the code for the United Third World Front, but rather the world code, meaning for everyone. And I love that extra detail about the world code being 666. There's something quite chillingly apropos about that kind of little detail. But my point is that his Snake Plissken's actions is just a solidification of the theme or the treatment that this film seems to be giving to the fact that we really are given the state as being almost like the prison, the place where we don't want to be. And indeed, there are instances where in this film, not all the characters, but some of the characters actually express feelings of not necessarily wanting to go back. I mentioned Taslima, for instance. She doesn't necessarily want to go back to the other side. I'd also mention Cuervo Jones as well. You know, in the earlier film, in Escape from New York, I would say that most of the characters were eager to escape. They wanted to escape New York and get back to the outside world. So that kind of feeling compelled to leave meant that they were looking for freedom, and what that implies, of course, is that what they had now inside was not freedom, but they had it outside. At least that's what their feeling was. So they wanted to escape. Here we have some people, of course, who want to escape and get out of there, like Hershey, etc. But look at Cuervo Jones, for example. His motivation is not necessarily to escape. He doesn't necessarily want to get out of there. He wants to make what is, in essence, a kind of really grave, stark political point, or to put it even more bluntly, he wants to almost initiate a kind of war between the two fronts to enable the invasion of the country to take place via his obtaining this particular key to this secret weapon, this almost doomsday device. And so his motivation, therefore, is not necessarily for escape, which thus I think also is consistent with this looking at the two worlds, the world of LA and the world outside of LA. And the two worlds being so stark in terms of a dystopia and an extreme freedom, to the extent that we have some characters that don't necessarily want to escape LA, and then we have that situation thus leading us to a potential interpretation, making us question what exactly is the world of freedom and what exactly is the world of authoritarian rule. And I think especially when we look at the brilliant conceptualization of Cliff Robertson's President, I think it becomes clear as to where John Carpenter's concerns lie with respect to this kind of delineation. And I think that focus makes this film, in essence anyway, in thrust, a film that can be distinguished from the earlier work, Escape from New York. And I should say also that while I'm on the topic of comparing with the earlier film Escape from New York, and then I also mentioned when I was younger, I had two concerns about the film. One being that it felt like it was different. It wasn't different enough from Escape from New York. Well, I think now that I look at it, I think that it does have a different enough feel so that it can stand on its own quite comfortably and quite confidently, in my opinion. And then the other thing that I was concerned about when I was younger was the fact that it was a film that felt like it was relying too much on special effects that maybe weren't necessarily the most photorealistic use of computer CGI based effects on screen that I had seen during that period, the 90s. But now that I look at it now, I think that that kind of non-realistic use of photo CGI effects in this film, I think in an interesting way, actually, in a roundabout way, work to the film's advantage. So, okay, what do I mean by this? Okay, so first of all, the John Carpenter films that we know and love, of course, rely oftentimes on really wonderful, spectacular, over-the-top special effects, or special effects that are used in a way to further the story, and a way that is always touching and moving and meaningful and very memorable, even if they are, on the one hand, quite simple special effects like we saw in films like Christine or Starman, or even more complex over-the-top special effects like what we saw in films like The Thing, for example, or even Big Trouble in Little China, and things of that nature, or Prince of Darkness, or things of that nature. But in any event, special effects have always been almost a given in most of John Carpenter's films. And the case is true for Escape from LA as well. But perhaps for some, the computer graphic effects use in this film might seem a little bit fake looking. It might seem a little bit too processed, or maybe not necessarily processed enough. Maybe for some it felt, maybe it feels like it needed one more pass through the computer or something in order to give it a more photorealistic look. Oh, I get all that. I felt that way when I first saw this film. But if I think about the theme of the film, or one of the themes of the film, which is this idea of an overly constructed state that is based on not only this theme of authoritarian rule, but also this idea of an overly constructed reality. And Snake Plissken is really trying to maneuver himself through this overly constructed reality. We see this overly constructed reality expressed in, as I say, this Bruce Campbell and the plastic surgery scene. We also see this in terms of virtual reality and the use of holograms, people who seem to be there but aren't. They don't exist in the same space. We also see this in terms of a kind of, how should I put it, a world where it's almost too over the top to be believed. And I think if we look at that kind of, or we look at the film through that kind of lens, in an interesting way, the fact that the CGI looks fake is really consistent with this idea of an overblown, overly constructed world. And it's like it has almost nowhere to go except by pushing the button that Snake does at the very end. So it's almost like the fact that he is pushing the button, he is destroying all the sources of power. All the electricity is gone. All those little waves are gone. So all these little bits of electricity that consume this world, that construct this world, and indeed in visual terms make up this world, as we even see in these CGI effects, those give us almost in a subliminal way this sense that this is indeed an electrically constructed world. And so the fact that he turns it off means that he is turning off all of this electricity, all of this power, all these computer effects that otherwise would form the basis of this overly constructed world that is also on the basis of, or also presented in this idea of authoritarian rule. And therefore, I think that in a very interesting way, the fact that this is obviously a computer-based film in certain moments makes the final act of Snake Plissken all the more of a cleansing feeling, if you know what I mean, because up to now we've been we've seen nothing but these images, but now it's all darkness and it's all black. And I think that that stark contrast that is made at that final moment is really quite poetic. It's almost as though the entire construction of the film in terms of these special effects, and maybe these over-the-top, overly unbelievable special effects, it almost feels like it was all meant to give that final moment extra meaning. And when it's nothing but darkness, it makes that darkness all the more special and all the more poetic and all the more meaningful. And in that darkness, what do we have as our closing image? We have the one and only Snake reaching out with his cigarette, lighting his cigarette, telling us, telling the world, telling the viewers, welcome to the human race. I think that moment becomes all the more powerful when we think about everything that we've seen up to then. So I think in a subliminal way, and maybe in an indirect way, those cheesy special effects actually work to the advantage of the film, in that it potentially gives that final moment an extra oomph, if you know what I mean. So those are the two major areas, as I say, when I was young, I had difficulty with. But now I'm very comfortable looking at this film, and I'm satisfied with the fact that those two criticisms that I had earlier are no longer there when I see the film now. And with that, I feel like this film flies for me. It absolutely flies for me. Is it the best John Carpenter film that I've ever seen? I don't know. I'm not sure. There's still room for many other films, of course. But does it need to be the best John Carpenter film I have ever seen in order to enjoy it? No. It is still very, very fun, very, very enjoyable. And I must say that it is primarily due to the return of the one and the only Snake Plissken. Kurt Russell and his screen persona, his screen presence is utterly sublime, totally amazing. The way that he is living in the skin and the clothes of the role is it gives me chills. Really, it gives me chills. And when he is back on screen, when you hear his voice, when you see him struggle, and when you see him donning his gear, putting on the black coat, the long coat, and the sort of the leather pants and all this stuff, he is back and he is doing what he does best. He is Snake Plissken, and he gets out of all of these impossible situations, life or death situations, in his Snake Plissken way. He is almost a Superman in the sense that he can get out of these situations that otherwise would cause him to die. We see this from the earlier bits with the submarine, and then we see him early on when he is within the populace of this LA world, and then we see him and how he has to get out of the challenge that is submitted to him by Cuervo Jones and the basketball hoops and other things of this nature. And so on the one hand, he is a kind of Superman. He is a superhero in the sense that he always gets out of any situation that he is confronted with. I mean, is it easy? No. There are moments where he is really getting by the skin of his teeth. But there are always, he always seems to be able to get out of the situation. But the fun of the film is seeing how it is he's able to get out of those situations, and how it is he is able to rely not only on his wits but also on a little bit of luck to get him there. But he does it in his oh-so Snake Plissken way. So on the one hand, he is a very great, roguish superhero. But what makes Snake Plissken here so interesting, is that he is also at the same time a character that almost evolves before our very eyes into a kind of everyman. He becomes a man of the people by the end of this film. And why do I say this? Well, because again, we see him up through the film, and he does these sort of almost death-defying acts, all the way to crashing in with a hand glider and doing the final attack on Cuervo Jones's base, and then flying the helicopter out there, and it's on fire because it's been fired on by the bazooka, and all of Hershey's men are killed, only he and Utopia are there, and they're just struggling to get the helicopter out of there. And all these other death-defying stunts, he's able to just manage to survive and get where he needs to go and do what he needs to do. So he's done all that, but he becomes an everyman, a hero of everyman by his actions at the end. He's always realized perhaps that the government, the authoritarian government, and Cliff Robertson's government is dystopian and authoritarian and perhaps even dangerous. And he also realizes that this is a society, at least from his point of view, that has nowhere else to go. And he puts it quite astutely at the end there. If he puts in one code, the other side loses. If he puts in the other code, the other side loses. So what he's going to do, he's going to put the code in for the entire world. So it's almost in a very, very interesting, poetic way. It's almost like what he does is so universal, and he's so democratic in the way he metes out his brand of justice at the end. And again, he is speaking for every man, I think. He is everybody at that moment. And he becomes a real, he becomes almost a spokesman for the ordinary human being, the ordinary person. And he no longer is a superhero, but he becomes someone who acts on behalf of everyone, because he knows that both sides are not providing what it is they need to provide. And so I find that evolution within the film so amazing, absolutely amazing. We did get hints of this aspect of Snake Plissken's character in Escape from New York, don't get me wrong, but for some reason, this film really solidifies that moment. I mean, he becomes like almost in a way blood brothers with someone like Roddy Piper's Nada in They Live, or even MacReady in The Thing. He also becomes a kind of every person that we can even say that someone like Jack Burton was in Big Trouble in Little China, and on and on. But here there is an almost a beautiful way that he's by his actions he is almost speaking up for the people who almost don't have a voice in this world, and he therefore is doing something that I think is in very great contrast to his superhero image all the way up through this film, which therefore that makes his characterization in this particular film, Escape from L.A., particularly fascinating. And I think it is one of the most fascinating turns of a well-beloved character that I've seen in some time. And it's a great turn. It's an absolutely great turn, and it's very brave, and it's very, very bold, and it works so well, in my opinion. And so this is Escape from L.A. in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. And it also works in the context of John Carpenter's filmography in the sense that we've seen John Carpenter in the past deal with other genres of film. Here, he is dealing with other genres of film as well, that sci-fi, dystopian, a retro future type of film that was very prevalent maybe in the 70s and 80s. We get a great taste of it here in the 90s. We also have westerns. There's the famous scene with the Bangkok Rules scene, which I think is one of the best scenes in the film. It's also one of the best sequences in John Carpenter's films overall. But that also gives us a flavor of the fact that this is a kind of Western film. Or it recalls the fact that Snake Plissken is also patterned after many Western anti-heroes. The Man with No Name, I think, comes to mind almost immediately. But this is also patterned after a certain type of Western film, also an escape film. We see these sorts of escape movie genre references in this film and in earlier films, and on and on and on. And so we see John Carpenter again working with the language of a cinematic past that he is comfortable with to give us, on the one hand, a kind of genre film, but also to give us a film that is also exploring the idea of paranoia, of authoritarian rule, and how that authoritarian rule plays on our minds, plays on our consciousness. We've seen how that affects the psyche in earlier films, and we see that played out here as well. Recall again what Hershey, the Pam Grier character, says, about government propaganda, and this idea of Plutoxin 7. Oh, the government has fooled you to think that Plutoxin 7 is this deadly virus, but in fact it's just it's harmless, and that's the government propaganda. That's what she says to Snake, and we realize that indeed she is right. We find out that the Plutoxin 7 thing was a mere play on him in order to get what it was that the government wanted him to do. And so that was in essence a kind of government propaganda. And so little things like that also play in to the notion of authoritarian rule and paranoia that we have seen in past John Carpenter films, as I mentioned, The Thing, They Leave, it's Prince of Darkness, etc. And so This plays with past cinema genre languages. It also plays with past John Carpenter films that we've seen thus up to now, and it plays with similar themes that we have also seen explored in past John Carpenter films. So this film, the more I think about it, the more I realize that it is a film by John Carpenter par excellence, and it fits in so well within the context of John Carpenter's films, so well. And I should say also that as a little, this is not a direct reference, of course, but if you think about the career of someone like Alfred Hitchcock, of course, had the instance of having the film The Man Who Knew Too Much, which he did twice. And so once in the 30s and once in the 50s. And so we have a similar situation here with Escape from New York and Escape from LA. Granted, they aren't remakes necessarily. They could be described as sort of reworkings of similar material. They also are sequels, or this is a film that is a sequel to the earlier film, of course. But there is a close kinship between these two films that is so close, and that we don't necessarily see a close kinship like this in any other film of John Carpenter's filmography. It's very much similar to how Alfred Hitchcock in his career didn't have other films that had as close a kinship as, say, the earlier Man Who Knew Too Much and the later Man Who Knew Too Much. So I kind of like that little parallel that gives a little extra added dimension to the fact that he is maybe recalling or reminding us of a kind of cinematic past that once was but no longer is. So that's John Carpenter for you. It's really great stuff. And therefore, now that I look back on this film and I watch this film, I see a very, very good film, and perhaps even a great film. And it is so thoroughly entertaining to me now, so much so that I look back on how I saw this film for the first time in the late 90s, and I think, my goodness, I have come such a long way from that moment. Now, this is not to say that anyone who dislikes the film now is wrong. Of course not. Of course not. If you have seen this film and you don't like this film, that is perfectly fine. That is a legitimate approach to have. That is true for any film that we see at any time. You are well within your rights to dislike anything. There's nothing that says you have to like something. But I do want to say, again, from my personal experience, that I have come so far from where I once was on this film. And I think it is due to the fact that I am able to see this film in a way that I wasn't able to see it when I was younger. And I think it's to my benefit that I'm able to see this film the way I'm able to see it now, because I do cherish this film and I value this film, and I see how important this film is in the context of John Carpenter's career, and perhaps also what he was trying to say. That was similar in tone to Escape from New York, but also, I would argue, quite different in tone to what he was trying to say in Escape from New York, thus making this film something that can stand on its own, be glorious, be proud, and be absolutely wonderful. This is the film Escape from L.A. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. Once again, please note that once the Shout Factory, Scream Factory release of this Blu-ray comes in, I will probably do my best to make another video on that, and maybe I might have some further comments on the film. So just stay tuned to this channel. Once that comes in, I will work as hard as I can to put out that video. But in the meantime, if you have any thoughts or comments about this film, please feel free to leave them in the comments section below. I'd love to hear what it is you have to say. And until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. My dear, dear friends, thank you so much for your time. I really mean that. It's always a pleasure for me to get to know you and to hear about your recommendations and thoughts about cinema. I learn something new every single day, and it is my great pleasure to know you, and I hope to continue to know you in the days and weeks and months and years to come. My dear friends, take very good care of yourselves, be well, and cheers.